Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Axiomatics webinar. Today's topic is the Chief Information Security Officer's Guide to Planning for Attribute-Based Access Control Success, or ABAC, of course. We'll look at the ABAC process and how that helps build up for success. I have the privilege of being joined today by Dan Bloom, who's a Principal Consultant with Security Architects Partners. Good afternoon, Dan. How are you doing?
Very well, David. Thank you for having me here.
Our pleasure. Would you like to quickly introduce yourself and introduce Security Architects Partners?
Of course. I've had a long career in information security, starting for most practical purposes with working with Burton Group, a research and advisory service that was acquired by Gartner back in the Burton Group day. I was the research director for their identity and privacy strategy service, and I did a lot of consulting engagements around identity management, helped them develop a reference architecture with technical positions on authentication, authorization, provisioning, and many other things that are relevant to our subject matter today. I left Gartner about 3 years ago and ended up about a year and a half ago with an independent consulting business that we call Security Architects Partners, because some of the folks that are working with me, like Doug Simmons and Dan Beckett, also come from Gartner and Burton Group, and we're very pleased to be here with you guys today, and thank you again.
Thanks, Dan. And for those of you who have never attended an Axiomatics webinar, my name is David Broussard. I take care of customer relations. That includes pre-sales, post-sales, and professional services. And that's about it from me. And on that note, let's have a quick look at the agenda. Today, we'll first look at what is attribute-based access control. Dan is going to walk us through that and walk us also through his experience of the industry. And then after that, I'll speak to the ABAC authorization lifecycle, which is a process that we've applied at different customer sites to help them develop their ABAC strategy. And with that, Dan, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Okay. What is attribute-based access control? We will find out on the next slide, if you'll advance it for me. I just pulled a couple definitions off of the net here. The first one is from Wikipedia. Attribute-based access control defines a runtime access control paradigm whereby access rights are granted to subjects through the use of policies which combine attributes together. The policies can use any type of attributes, subject attributes, resource attributes, or environment attributes. As I said, that's adapted from Wikipedia. What I adapted was I added the word runtime before access control, because we're primarily going to talk about the application of this technology to make runtime access control decisions at the point of use. I also changed the word user to subject in 2 places, so you see they're bold there, because so much of what we do today is at a level of indirection. You know, we have services or processes, web services acting for us, either using their own credentials or identity or using our human identity behind them. And this gives you a hint of the complexity that's motivating attribute-based access control as one of the more advanced methods for access control. Second definition here, I won't read it, but it is from the NIST Special Publication 800-162. The federal government in the U.S. Through the Federal Identity, Credentials, and Access Management Committee under the CIO Council, or Federal CIO Council, is very focused on a number of programs, including the personal identity verification cards, also e-authentication, and ABAC. And so they have a very similar definition to what you see with Wikipedia. It's a rich model. When we talk about authorization, often it's not just who you are, which is what authentication gives you. Your user identity, your name, is authenticated as belonging to the entity at the other end of the wire in the interaction. but also what you are, or what role are you in? Are you a customer? Are you an employee? Are you a contractor? Sometimes it's important to know what time of day or what day of the week is happening, the authentication is happening, for example, because that could trigger an anomaly detection in that some systems shouldn't be used at certain times. Sometimes where. I remember at one time I was overseas and I was trying to access my bank account and wouldn't let me in because I was coming from Germany and normally I came from the US. So that was an example of attribute-based access control being applied at the moment of authentication. How? Maybe they want to verify that you're using a trusted device. Why is a little more difficult, but you do see attributes about training that you've received in HIPAA, for example, that contribute to why you should be allowed to access something or to be authenticated to a certain system. But let's go on. I think that gives you the basic idea of the richness that we can have when we bring all the attributes into access control. But there's some other characteristics of ABAC that you typically find. For example, authorization is often externalized from the business logic or from the application code. So the authorization function is being called through an API rather than coded directly into the application. And when we get to some later slides, we'll talk about why that's important. One reason we can see it's important right away is that you can centralize the authorization logic. Not necessarily centralize everything about the authorization, but you can centralize the authorization decision or centralize the management of the authorization policy through a variety of methods related to any of the attributes being used. And so the authorization is policy-driven, again, expressed as configurable policies rather than as code. And it can be contextual. When I walked through the example of contextual authentication as a form of ABAC or a form of contextual authorization, you saw that many different kinds of attributes came into play relating to the context of who you are, where you are, what you are, when is the time of day, why you should be getting this access. And then finally, when we abstract authorization to a single point of management and decouple it from the business logic, you provide the opportunity to leverage a number of different standards that can produce attributes in a way that they can be shared across domains. That's one of the reasons, for example, that the federal government's very interested in ABAC, because with it being the largest organization in the world, or one of them, I guess, there's the Chinese government, but the federal government is very big and it has many different agencies and many different departments within large agencies, and they have many different systems, and yet they need to share information while keeping pretty tight control over who gets access to the information. So standards are very important in their context, and that's why they have this interest in ABAC. Standards like the SAML attribute assertion, which has been around for 10, 15 years now. There's Axiomatics that was created fairly soon after SAML, which goes deeper into how policy is managed. There's XDI, there's OAuth using SAML assertions. There's OpenID Connect, which is an authentication standard, but through it, user information attributes can be queried. Let's go on to the next one. Next slide, and just a quick tour of the ABAC landscape. You may only have started hearing the acronym ABAC in the last couple of years, but the concept of centralized authorization or externalized authorization has been around for a long time under many different names. My personal favorite, 10 or 15 years ago when I was working on a authorization decision point with Burton Group for the reference architecture, was rules-based access control. So you change one letter in rules-based access control and it becomes a good thing, or so I thought at the time anyway, but we have all these other names. In the financial industry, the term entitlements engine or entitlements management has been popular. The idea of centralizing an authorization policy decision point, which is something that we'll get into in a later slide, has been around for a while as well, and that policy decision or enforcement point that's centrally managed has been called authorization manager or dynamic authorization management, to suggest that it can be dynamic and that the criteria that it uses are changing and changeable. Attribute broker, used sometime to reflect the ability to exchange different kinds of attributes depending on semantics. A lot of different names that it's gone under, and that's made it seem very complicated and arcane. But it isn't really that complicated and arcane. A couple of other things it's not group-based access control, and it's not roles-based access control, or ABAC. However, ABAC can use group memberships and role occupant information as attributes in making authorization decisions. Now, where in the landscape do we see ABAC provided by products? Broadly, we've seen it mainly in two different types of products, 2 or 3 different types of products. The highest form of evolution of the ABAC-enabled product is the externalized authorization management, or EAM. This is a Gartner term. And this type of product provides a centralized runtime authorization. It's fine-grained, able to use different attributes in different contexts, able to apply centrally managed policies to those attributes, and that makes it very versatile. Now, the legacy installed base, though, for authorization and authentication is more likely to be provided in many companies today through web access management tools like the CA SiteMinder and others that provide coarse-grained authorization as they perform web single sign-on services mainly. However, when I say coarse-grained authorization, that is because typically a WAM product only has rudimentary attribute-based access control, and that it consumes relatively few attributes. Its major focus is on that web single sign-on, on APIs to popular applications, and does not support as many of the standards that I referred to on the previous slide, or have this fine-grained attribute focus. API gateways are another type of product where a centralized authorization is done and where ABAC may be applied. And then there's also related products, or products that are closely related to ABAC. For example, we've seen Axiomatics paired with Radiant Logic, a virtual directory product in some of the customers that we work with. Let's go on to the next slide, David. And now, having covered the landscape and having covered the basic definition, let's talk about why we really care about ABAC today. And it is, of course, all about security. If you consider the news today, I was just looking to see what was happening in the world that I could relate to this webinar, and I found an FDIC breach. That's a Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, lost $44 100,000 records. Although they say it was no harm done, it was just a case of an employee leaving the agency and having some data still on his personal device, and they have no evidence of wrongdoing. Let's hope that's true, because it's not always true. The problem with outdated credentials, the problem with people still having access to systems or to data that are no longer appropriate to their role, or having access after they've left their organization, is legion in the industry. And so anything we can do to have more dynamic authentication and authorization that sort of updates itself from a single point of truth when an employee leaves your organization or some life cycle event occurs, dramatically improves the security of your operation. So let's talk about the challenges, and then how ABAC can provide a solution and some of the benefits through that solution. The challenge that we see motivating customers to adopt ABAC is that they have a hard time keeping their identity information up to date. They have a hard time keeping their rules and access criteria around the identity information up to date. And why is that so hard? It's because of these bullets shown on the slide here. First of all, enterprise IT tends to be very diverse. A lot of the companies or government agencies that are interested in ABAC have high security needs, and they're also very large organizations. And yet, they get work done best, like any other human organization. They get work done best in smaller groups. And so some say silos are endemic to the human condition because of that. And so we need to know in advance that any authorization systems we create, any identity management systems that we create, are going to have to allow a lot of flexibility for people to work in groups and kind of define their own rules. But we need to have some kind of centralized visibility to that. We need to have some kind of reuse. The trouble is that the tools we're given through systems like Active Directory, like operating systems, are very primitive. Single attributes, groups, and roles are primitive constructs. They're not flexible enough for us to achieve this balance that we need between enabling a lot of small groups to work in an agile fashion in a big organization, and yet having some kind of centralized control and visibility of policy. The constructs are primitive by themselves and make it difficult to do that, especially when authorization logic is embedded in most applications. And because of these things, authorization fails to scale across domains, across administrative domains of control. And so that's why in the red box we've struggled chronically with e-commerce boundaries, where different companies have to work together across the supply chain. And now we're struggling with cloud computing, where IT itself is becoming more decentralized to enable that division of labor, where different software as a service applications or infrastructure as a service platforms can enable you to get the best, most cost-effective, agile, best-of-breed service solution. But it's all across different domains. And so if we go on to the next slide, David, we can look at how we solved that for years. We have, in fact, been looking for a way out of the authorization quagmire. I say quagmire because our old CEO, Jamie Lewis at Burton Group, used to say, authentication is just a battle, but authorization is like the land war in Asia. And now, though, consensus is starting to build around a way to solve that dilemma that I was talking about, where you have a need for a lot of flexibility and agility in small groups, but a centralized control of policy and visibility, and you set the guidelines and the boundaries. And consensus is finally building for ABAC, as it is a approach that can be federated through the standards I mentioned, like SAML, like OpenID Connect, and therefore it can be domain independent, because once it's federated, the source of truth can come from any domain. It does not have to be centrally managed. The only thing that has to be centrally managed is the trust relationships about which domains you. And again, we see the rules-based coming in there. Rules-based approach to runtime authorization that's flexible. So that sentence there, federated, flexible, rules-based approach to runtime authorization, is a bit of a mouthful. In a word, ABAC. Its time has come. According to Gartner, by 2020, 70% of enterprises will use ABAC as a dominant mechanism to protect critical assets, up from less than 5% today. And I think we have a lot of people here on the webinar to learn about it because of that high level of growth and interest we're seeing in the market. So if we go on to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the benefits. And David, feel free to chime in with what you're seeing in the industry among your customers. Basically here with ABAC as a solution, we have something that scales better than RBAC. It reduces operational costs, and it's more dynamic. You don't have to do all the role engineering in advance. So it lends itself to today's agile DevOps approaches. It bridges the gap between IT and the business. And that's important because you need solutions that are flexible enough that you can model authorization in business terms, and the business can control it within certain guidelines. So you can reflect the business requirements directly in your ABAC configuration, and you can have easier and faster auditing and compliance checks by having a centralized set of concepts, a standard set of concepts, and visibility of those, and also centralized points of runtime authorization. This enables relationships and dynamic scenarios. In healthcare, we've seen the ability to grant physicians access to medical records only of those patients that they are assigned to. So that saves operational time. The doctor doesn't have to go through central hospital administration to get access to the pharmaceutical record of the patient that's having a heart attack on the stretcher. All that has to be true is that when this patient was admitted, he was assigned to be the doctor, or is in the group that was assigned to be the doctor, enabling better care. And yet you have patient privacy, because the doctor can't just look at every patient's records anytime in any context that he or she wants to. So you have that healthy balance there. In finance, we've seen ABAC used to do things like grant traders the ability to approve transactions below their limit, provided that it's a transaction that someone else created. They did not create it themselves, so you have a separation of duty going on as well. This eliminates fraud, and it eliminates toxic combinations, and yet it empowers the trader under the right guidelines and in the right context to make decisions at rapid speed to generate revenue for the bank. So we see there that these rules grant physicians access to medical records of those patients they are assigned to, or grant traders the ability to approve transactions below their limit, but that they did not create themselves. These are all contextual, and they're all expressed in attributes, and those attributes can be readily consumed at a central point through multiple sources of truth and through standards-based protocols to allow a lot of flexibility, but also a lot of centralized control of the guidelines through which policy is enacted, and visibility of how it's being applied. So I think that's what I wanted to say. David, you're seeing any other benefits to ABAC, or anything you wanted to add to some of these use cases?
Well, if I look on the technical level of things, I think one of the key wins is the relationship aspect that ABAC brings to the table. One of the limitations of role-based access control is to not be able to compare user attributes to resource attributes. Now with ABAC, you can do that, and that's what I call the relationship. Also, very often, customers will ask for the ability to define authorization in terms of the location of the user, the risk of a transaction, the IP of a user at the time of the day. These are all contextual attributes that bring in, that enable those dynamic scenarios. Now,
Yeah, we've been talking about, being able to do that, to have a richer context for authentication for years, but it's
right.
always been very challenging because none of the systems that were involved in the process of access or what was being accessed spoke the same language.
Correct. So that's also something else that's interesting. If you look at ABAC, many different developer frameworks, be it .NET or PHP and so on and so forth, have had some form of ABAC before, but it was not standardized. It was still very technical. ABAC and ZAC will give you this ability to be technology neutral so that you can reuse the same ABAC framework for your databases, your APIs, your homegrown applications, your off-the-shelf applications from one central location. So that's the centralization piece of ABAC. And Dan, thanks for the overview of ABAC benefits and challenges, or I should say the other way around, challenges and benefits. Now I'm going to take you through the authorization lifecycle as we see it today when we talk to customers. And before I do that, you mentioned that ABAC did have an architecture, and you did mention a couple of the points. This here is a great slide to cover the basics of the architecture. It's really not complicated at all. What you have here on the left is a set of users, and those users want to access a resource on the right-hand side, and that resource could be anything from data inside a database to an API call to an application to a web portal, so on and so forth. And what we're going to do in between those two is we're going to deploy a policy enforcement point, or PEP. And the policy enforcement point is the piece that is responsible for protecting the application. So depending on the nature of the application, you'll have different types of policy enforcement points that are adapted to the application they're protecting. Either way, the enforcement point intercepts the business flow, converts it into an authorization request, and sends it off to the policy decision point. The policy decision point, or PDP, is really the core of the architecture. It's the brains of the architecture, if you will. This is where decisions are being made, reached, and returned. And those decisions are being produced based on the incoming authorization request, and based on the policies the policy decision point has been configured with, which is what we see on the left-hand side here, and based on additional attributes that might be retrieved from underlying policy information points, or PIPs. Those PIPs are databases, web services, LDAPs, anything where you store metadata that you might be interested in. Now, this architecture can actually be broken down into different parts. So the first part here at the top is the enforcement piece, and it's decoupled from the part below, which is the decision piece here in green. And finally, the third piece that I haven't talked about yet is the management piece. And the management piece is the part you use to define your authorization policies, and you do that through a component called the policy administration point. Now, this is the typical ABAC architecture. The terms, by the way, are not specific to ABAC. They predate ZAC as well. They've been around for quite some time now. What's worth noting as well is that in terms of IPs, you'll note on the right-hand side, in terms of IPs, we can integrate with virtual solutions as well, virtual databases or virtual directories. Dan, you mentioned the ability to use like logic. This is where we would integrate with products.
David, you're getting a little bit of distortion. I don't know if everybody's hearing it, but I was hearing some distortion.
Okay.
In your, I don't know what you can do, but I just thought I'd let you know.
Okay. Is that better now?
Now it's better. Yeah.
Okay. Great. My apologies. I'll blame it on the weather. And on that note, let's go ahead and have a look at the authorization lifecycle. So the first thing that I want to highlight before I go into each and every step is that this is a living lifecycle. As we work with more and more customers, we refine the process all the time, and we find better ways of addressing the ABAC, the attribute-based access control lifecycle. But the bottom line is that it's not very different from existing software development life cycles. You start by defining your scope or defining your use case, and you work through different steps until you've achieved the implementation of that use case. Now, let's go ahead and have a look at the steps one by one. So the first one is defining your use case. What is it you're dealing with? Or do you want to handle medical records? Do you want to work with banking transactions? You have to decide what your use case is. And to do that, you'll be working with business analysts and application owners who are the individuals, the actors who own the challenge, who own the use case. They are the stakeholders in this life cycle. The goal of this step is to make sure that you define a well-scoped use case, not a vague one. It's really important that your use case be well-scoped for the success of that use case. You want to make sure that everyone agrees on the terms and conditions of the use case. So as an example here, we'll secure access to financial transactions online. Once you've defined your use case, you can actually focus on gathering authorization requirements. So the use case in itself, it's not specific to authorization at all. It could just be the use case for which you're developing a new application. Now the second step here focuses on authorization or access control, and the actors are a little bit different. You still have the business analysts, you still have the application owners, but in addition to that, you'll be dealing with security architects, potentially information security architects as well, who are in charge of gathering the authorization requirements and who might be aware of the global requirements, the global security requirements within the enterprise. The point of this step is to identify the authorization requirements from the use case, from that particular application, but also identify global requirements that might come from the enterprise, things like denying access before 9 a.m. or denying access from an unknown location. So examples of requirements here, the first one, deny access to transactions outside the US, that would probably be a global requirement. The second one, managers can approve transactions that are less than their approval limit. That would be an application specific or perhaps a compliance specific requirement. So you will have different sources of requirements, and you can gather them, you can gather those different sources and compile them together in a list of requirements. Once you've gathered your requirements, and by the way, this can be an iterative process. You might actually revisit the list of requirements and add new requirements as you go. Once we've identified those requirements, the next step is to identify the building blocks of those requirements. Since we're dealing with ABAC, or attribute-based access control, we're going to gather or identify the attributes. And the attributes are any bit of data that describe the situation, describe the user, describe the resource. And when you look at your requirements, it's very simple. As a matter of fact, all you need to do is highlight the key words that matter within the authorization requirement. And this is something you'll do, again, with the business analysts, with the application owners, with the security architects, but also with the data architects, with those responsible for your information model, with those responsible for defining the different entities that take part in your authorization requirements. If, for instance, you're dealing with a bank account, you need to know that the bank account has different attributes like the account balance or the account location or the account branch name, so on and so forth. If you're dealing with a user, you need to identify the attributes or the parameters that make up the user, such as the user role, the user department, the user citizenship, if it's relevant, so on and so forth. So you want to identify those attributes, and you want to identify their source. Do they come from LDAP? Do they come from a database? You also want to make sure you flag them because you want to do better governance on those attributes. Since they now are part of your authorization requirements, they do have an impact on the authorization lifecycle. And the next step, the first three steps so far, by the way, they're more about working with your information model, working with the use case, gathering requirements. The fourth step starts to enter the space of implementation. So here, we're going to look at the original authorization requirements. We're going to look at the attributes we've identified, and we're going to rework the requirements into technical policies. And that will be the responsibility of dedicated policy authors or security administrators responsible for managing and maintaining the ABAC solution. And you're going to implement the policies using the available tool set. That could be the Axiomatics policy server, it could be the Alpha plugin for Eclipse, it could be different tools that you can use to implement your policies. We typically implement policies in XACML at the end of the day, but you could choose to use a different format if you wanted to do that. Now, an example of a policy in pseudo-technical terms is here, user with role equal to manager can do action equal to approve on object of type equal to transaction if user approval limit is greater than transaction amount. Note how I've highlighted the words using different colors. So in green we have user attributes, in blue we have action attributes, and in orange we have resource attributes. The whole point is to show the different dimensions, the different categories of attributes within your authorization policies. And again, there's no limit to how many attributes you can use in a policy or what categories they can belong to. Moving on to the next step, once we've authored the authorization policies, we can actually test the policies. And that is a very important step in your ABAC lifecycle. If you want to be successful, you want to make sure you run systematic tests, complete tests, and tests that address different dimensions to the authorization policies. And actually going back to the step called gather authorization requirements, in that step, in that second step, you also want to define your acceptance tests and agree on the tests with the application owners, with the business analysts. In the testing phase, you'll be dealing with policy authors, of course, because as they write the policies, they want to verify the policies and make sure they're writing the correct policies. You'll be dealing with the business analysts who will be looking at the test results and making sure that they do correspond to what was expected. And you'll be dealing with QA testers who want to run the tests in batch mode when you deploy new versions of policies to make sure that the new versions do not break any of the existing tests. And really the goal of the tests is to verify the accuracy of your policy, to verify the coverage of your policy with respect to the initial requirements, but also to eliminate conflicts and gaps that might arise from writing and combining policies together. So here we have a couple of examples. Can Joe approve transaction T? And you would expect either a yes or a no. You would compare that to the response you got back from the authorization service. Therefore, you know whether the test had passed. Or you could do an open-ended test. For instance, what can a manager view? You could even do gap analysis testing, such as, is there any way a non-U.S. citizen can view U.S. data? Moving on to the following step, we can finally, once we've authored the policies and tested the policies, we can deploy the architecture. So this is where you choose where to do the enforcement, what the nature of the enforcement point will be, whether you're dealing with an API, gateway, or a database proxy. Once you've deployed your architecture and tested the architecture for performance and resilience, you can go ahead and deploy your policies. There you'll be dealing with the traditional software development lifecycle, really, where you'll promote your policies from the dev environment to the test environment to the QA environment to the production environment. You'll be dealing with the QA engineer, with the operations engineer. This is no different, really, from handling different software deployments. The only difference is that it's much easier to promote policies than it is to deploy code. So the whole idea behind ABAC is to make those deployment cycles much faster. And finally, to close the loop, we can go ahead and run access reviews. That's also something that's a little different from the traditional way of doing access control based on roles. In this case, because authorization is defined based on attributes and more importantly, based on policies, it's much easier to run those access reviews. The actors will be the same as before, the compliance managers, auditors, the information security officer, but also the managers of different teams that need to review the access that their employees have. With the access review step, you want to verify two things. You want to verify that only allowed access is happening. So you want to run tests or run compliance audits on the logs, on the access logs of the authorization service, but you also want to verify that the policies that are in production only allow what should be allowed, even before access is attempted. So types of access reviews you can run are who approved transaction X or what canal is due. So the first one is an after-the-fact audit log. The second one is an access review before the fact, before access even happened, or it could also happen after, but we don't rely on access having happened by that stage. And on that note, we've got just about 16 minutes to wrap it up. So Dan, you and I were discussing before this webinar, and you were telling me that you're seeing a huge increase in attribute-based access control, a lot more demand in the last couple of years. We've seen that as well, in particular in finance, government, also healthcare. Veterans Affairs is one of our customers in healthcare. They use attribute-based access control to secure veterans' healthcare data. But we also see interest in other verticals like education services, manufacturing. And Dan, we're not the only ones seeing this as well. If you read different reports from the likes of Coopinger-Cole, from the likes of Gartner, they all confirm that trend. Of course, Gartner, as you said earlier, has stated that by 2020, 70% of enterprises would be using one form of another or of ABAC. So we're really excited to see that happening little by little. It's a fast-growing market for sure. And then here below, Dan, there's a link to your website, I believe, where attendees can find more resources about ABAC and identity management. Do you want to say a couple of words on that?
Yeah, just to say that it's going to be exciting between now and 2020, seeing this market go from 5% to 80% if Gartner's correct, and clearly it's going to be a whole range of use cases. Some of them may be fairly simple. Let's just put a product in place, and now instead of approving financial transactions based on a user ID and password, we're also looking at some context as well and adding a lot of security through that. But then there's also going to be some enterprises that have a lot of work to do to bring their security programs into sufficient maturity where they can reliably consume attributes from multiple sources of truth across multiple divisions, and they'll have to make a number of architecture decisions in order to get their environment on a course that they can get the most out of ABAC. And I think that's where security architects partners can be helpful for organizations that are trying to figure out where to start and how to create a security roadmap in which ABAC can be one of the missing pieces that's filled in to bring them a better level of protection.
Thanks, Dan. And on that note, I believe we can go ahead and move to the Q&A session. We have about 10 minutes left, or a little less than 10 minutes. And I have a first question. I don't know if you want to have a go at it first, or if you'd rather I take it, so you just let me know. How do we implement ABAC in existing applications that were not built with this concept in mind?
So there's a number of possibilities. Some of them may involve modifying the application, and some of them may involve deploying a an intermediary process or something in the middle between the application and the resource, such as the API gateway. So it really is going to depend on what type of application you have and what your constraints are.
Correct. That's what we see a lot of. So when you have legacy applications, you essentially have two models possible, two approaches. Either one, you do what I would call the traditional ABAC approach of intercepting your business flow using a policy enforcement point. So you'd have to identify an interface where you can put an intermediary in front of it or an interceptor in front of it, and then convert the flow into an authorization request. However, that model does not always work. I'm thinking, for instance, if you're dealing with a web portal, and that web portal, if you put an interceptor in front of it, you'll be intercepting HTML pages. HTML is not very well structured, so it'll be hard to make good authorization decisions on that type of interception. So really, depending on the nature of the application, you will have to choose what works best. And in the second approach here, when you're dealing with those types of applications where interception doesn't make a lot of sense, then you have to look at whether those apps have an internal authorization framework where you can feed authorization logic into. As an example, if you have a cloud-based application that all it has is a web portal, but internally it has a way to manage permissions, then if you can convert your authorization policies into those permissions, then you can feed them into that internal authorization framework. Another great example of that.
Yeah, that. How's this going to hold up over time? How are you going to manage change? And so that's, you always want to find the cleanest solution, a good architectural solution that works across a variety of use cases if you can.
Right. So was that a question for me, Dan, or was it just an additional statement?
Oh, it was just an additional comment. I'm not sure that you heard everything I said because I heard you starting to break up again, but now you're coming through again. So let's move on to the next one.
Great. So here's another great question. What is the best way to introduce ABAC to the business, since this is a mindset change from simply using roles to defining attributes to provide access?
Well, that's an interesting one because really the business has to start to see the data that it uses and consumes and obtains about users and systems and applications that can be applied to authorization as sort of a strategic asset, right? They have to see it as something that can be governed, something that can be built up over the long term to benefit the company.
Correct. I think there is a lot of education that needs to take place. I do think that the life cycle, if you abstract that away, it's a good way to talk to the business. Also, we do provide what we call a discovery questionnaire, which is a good way for the business to start thinking about their ABAC challenges. Sometimes the business, they don't realize that they have an ABAC challenge. So that's a good way to highlight it for them.
Yeah, I think really starting with just educating the business stakeholders on the fact that you've got an identity program within the organization and that you're working on developing an ABAC approach, and that therefore they can be thinking in terms of roles in terms of what's the authoritative source of identity, what's the logic of authorization, what's the authoritative source of those attributes, what can we reuse. It's not, I think, an overnight process. It's
Right.
one where there needs to be some education and there needs to be some regular meeting of the minds, so that and there has to, but at the same time, it would be good if you can find some low-hanging fruit, some early use case where the benefits of ABAC can be shown, where you can demonstrate success in that one use case, and then try to build some interest in broadening the applicability of ABAC throughout the organization.
Right. Thanks, Dan. And I think that on that note, we're gonna wrap it up and give everyone a couple minutes back of their day. This was a great session. Thanks so much, Dan, for taking part in this webinar with us. There are a couple more.
You're welcome.
Thank you. There are a couple more questions we didn't get to. We will be sending answers to all the questions we received over email, so stay tuned for that. Again, thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone, for attending, and have a nice day.